Here we're going to look at the major bones of the skull. So right here we're going to start off, this will be the frontal bone. This green one here will be the parietal bone. This brown one down here will be the temporal bone. This blue one back here will be the occipital bone. This red one right here will make up part of the sphenoid bone. This yellow one here will make up the zygomatic bone. If we turn around to the front, the purple will be the maxillary bone. Your jaw bone, which is actually called your mandible. These white ones here on your nose, those will be called your nasal bones. With these off-colored ones in here, these will be called your lacrimal bones. Now we will look at the major sutures of the skull. If we look at the first one here, this one separating the parietal bones and the frontal bone, that'll be called our coronal suture. This one going down straight down the middle of our head will be called the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture can extend down the forehead, and that can be called a metopic suture. Then if we flip around to the back, this one separating the parietal bone and the occipital bone will be called the lambdoid suture. And then the suture on the side here between the temporal bone and the parietal bone will be called the squamous suture. Now we're going to look at the major fontanelles of the skull. If you see here, this is going to be called our anterior fontanelle. Branching off of that is that example of a metopic suture. If we move to the back of the skull, where that lambdoid suture is going to occur, you'll see the posterior fontanelle. If we're moving to the side, you will see back here where the mastoid process will occur, there will be a mastoid fontanelle there, one on each side. And then up here by the sphenoid bone, there will be a sphenoid fontanelle, one on each side. Now we'll take a look at the frontal bone. The frontal bone will have two frontal sinuses, and that'll be just embedded here within the bone. And can't see one on here, but they just be little air pockets within the bone. The next structure we're going to look at is the supraorbital foramen, or notch. This particular skull has a notch here and a foramen here. Then we're going to look at the squamous part of the frontal bone, and that's best described on the top skull, and that's just the really thin part on the top. The frontal bone also makes up the roof of the orbit, so that'll be this top part right in here. Now we're going to take a look at the occipital bone. The flat part of the bone here is just like on any other bone, is going to be called the squamous part of the bone. And then on the squamous part of the bone you have two protuberances. You have an external occipital protuberance, that's going to be the bump on the back of your head. And then you have its counterpart, the internal occipital protuberance as well. Then if we flip this over, we can see the two occipital condyles. And those are going to articulate with the C1 vertebrae. Next you have the big hole in the bottom of your head, that's going to be the foramen magnum. That's going to be where your spinal column inserts to your brain. And then on the side here, in the condyles, you'll see the hypoglossal foramen. Now we're going to look at the parietal bones. There's only really one thing you need to know about the parietal bones, and that'll be the two bones are actually just a squamous, just a flat bone. They border right, here's the border with the frontal bone, here's the border with the occipital bone, and on the inside you can see it's really flat again.
Alright, we're going to be going over the temporal bone here. It's this maroon colored bone. So I'm going to take it off. Alright, to start with, we're going to have your external acoustic meatus. Then we're going to have your zygomatic process. We're going to have your mandibular fossa. Your mandibular fossa is the depression where the head of the mandible is going to fit in there. Then we have your styloid process. Then we're going to have your mastoid process. Then we have your stylomastoid foramen. It's going to be a little hole right behind that styloid process, right there. Then we have your carotid canal. The external opening is going to be here. Then it's going to come over, and it's going to come out over here. Then we have your foramen lacerum. For that, I need to go over to this full skull. You can see your foramen lacerum right there. Your foramen lacerum, when you're alive, is covered with cartilage, but when you die, some of that cartilage will come away and it'll appear. Then we have your jugular foramen. It's going to sit right here. Then, going back to the other model. So if we come around internally, your internal acoustic meatus will be here. And then the petrous part of the temporal bone is going to be here. It's all this rigid area. And then we're going to have the squamous part. That's going to be this smooth, thin area. Now I'm going to come over to this full skull and just go over the structures one more time so you can get yourself orientated on the real skull. Okay, so starting at the top, you have your external acoustic meatus right here. You can see your zygomatic process right here. You can see your mandibular fossa right here. We have your styloid process right here. We have your mastoid process right here. We have your stylomastoid foramen sitting just posterior to the styloid process. And we have your carotid canal. You can see the external opening here. It's going to come horizontally. And then we flip the skull around. You can see the internal opening of that carotid canal right here. Then going back to external. You can again see that foramen lacerum. And also the jugular foramen. Going back internal again. You can see your internal acoustic meatus. And then the petrous part of the temporal bone. This rigid area, and the squamous part of the temporal bone, smooth area. Alright, we're going to be going over your sphenoid bone. It's this red one right here. So, right now you're looking at it from an anterior view, or from the front. So the first structure that we're going to have on there is going to be right here. Be your sella turcica. Sella turcica means Turkish saddle, and the pituitary gland is going to sit right in there. And then our next structure, flip back that anterior view. We have your pterygoid processes. In your pterygoid processes, there is a medial plate and a lateral plate. It's pterygoid processes. And your sphenoid sinus is going to be, it's going to sit right behind here. You can't see it on this model, but it's just an opening right behind these. Then we're going to have your foramen rotundum. You can see that right there, sitting inferior to that superior orbital fissure. So foramen rotundum. And if we flip around to the back side, again, you can see your foramen rotundum right there. Then, continuing back, we can see that foramen ovale right there. And then this structure here you do not need to know, but just FYI, it's the foramen spinosum. And a useful trick I remembered was ROS, so rotundum, ovale, spinosum, ROS. Then our next structure is the optic foramen. You can see it right there. You can think of it like it's grabbing the handlebars on that Harley. If you go back to an anterior view, you can see that optic foramen right there. Finally, we can see your superior orbital fissure. Now, going over to the full skull model, we can show you the structures on here. Here we can see that sella turcica. Then, flipping around, you can see those pterygoid processes, the medial and lateral plates. And going, your sphenoid sinus is going to sit right inferior to that sella turcica, but you can't see it on this model. Next, I'm going to turn around here so that you can see your foramen rotundum right there. Then, just posterior to that, just as before, we have the foramen ovale and the foramen spinosum. So, ROS. Then, if we turn this around, again, we can see your foramen ovale. And then, if we go back to an anterior view, you can see your optic foramen. Also, we can see your superior orbital fissure. And your inferior orbital fissure. Flipping around one more time. From the back side there, this is the superior orbital fissure. Finally, we can see that optic foramen. Alright, now we're going to go over your ethmoid bone. Your ethmoid bone is this yellow bone here. There's a couple structures that you're going to need to know on this ethmoid bone. First, you're going to see this large process coming out the top. It's called the crista galli. Coming out the top there. Next, you can't really see it super well on this model, but there's a bunch of little holes in here, and those are called the cribriform plate. The plate with all those holes in them. The olfactory foramina is each individual hole. And then the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, you can't see very well on this model either, but it's going to be running straight down here, straight down from that crista galli. Then your superior nasoconcha is going to be here, and then your middle nasoconcha is going to be here. This model is not the best for showing them, so you're going to need to look in either in your book or on one of the different models to see those. And then finally, the ethmoid sinuses are going to sit posteriorly to that ethmoid bone right about here. Okay, now we're going to go over the maxilla and some of the surrounding bones. So this purple bone here is going to be your maxilla. Some of the structures on there. Starting with your alveolus. Your alveolus is the socket that the teeth sit within, so you can't really see it on here, but it'd be like each one of these would be an alveolus. Okay, moving back to this one. Alveolar process is the little bumps that go up and around each tooth, so there's still a purple part on this model. Then your dental arcade, or dental arch, is this whole arch of the teeth. And your maxillary sinuses are going to sit superior to this maxilla bone. So it's actually going to sit like this. So it's sitting right up there. You can't see it here. Then your incisive fossa is just referring to this depression right here, right under your teeth, and you can feel that in your own mouth, just that little depression up there. Then the infraorbital foramen, if we flip around to the front here, the infraorbital foramen sit right here, and they're going to sit right underneath those eyes, so that's why they're called infraorbital. Moving on, we can see here, it's going to be your palatine bone, and together with your maxilla, the palatine bone is going to make up your hard palate of your mouth. So maxilla and palatine bone together make up the hard palate. And then another bone that we can see on the front here is this white one. It's going to be your nasal bone. And on the side here, you can see your lacrimal bone. And then just one more thing to note is that here we can see that your maxilla makes up the floor of that orbit going around that eye socket.
Now we'll take a look at the zygomatic bone. That's going to be this bone right here. The only structure that you need to know on the zygomatic bone is going to be this process here, and that's called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone.
Alright, now we're going to take a look at your inferior nasal concha, which is a bone of its own. If we turn this structure around, we can see that inferior nasal concha sitting right there, the brown one. It's also right there. A structure that's not on this model is the Vomer. So we'll go here. You can see your Vomer coming right here, right down the middle there. Then on this, we can also see your two inferior nasal concha.
Here we have the mandible. First term you need to know is the alveolus. The alveolus is what the tooth sits in. It's also known as the tooth socket. Then we have the alveolar process. The alveolar process is just the projection around the tooth. There's the alveolar process there. Alveolar process. It's just the projection around the tooth. And then we have the dental arcade. Dental arcade is this whole arch. This whole arch is also called the dental arch. And then we have the mandibular head, or mandibular condyle. It's going to be right here. The mandibular head, also called the mandibular condyle. And then the condylar process. The condylar process is going to hold up that mandibular head, or mandibular condyle. The coronoid process is right here in front. So the coronoid process. And then we have two foramen on the mandible. We have the mental foramen. The mental foramen is going to be anterior right here. And then we have the mandibular foramen. So we're going to turn it around. And the mandibular foramen is going to be right there. The mandibular foramen.
Alright, now we're going to go over your hyoid bone. This here is your hyoid bone, and this here is an infant mandible. I have them side by side because they can be easily confused. But we're going to take a look at some of the structures here on this hyoid bone. You're going to have the greater horns, and then the body. And this one you can't really see the lesser horns, so we're not going to worry about it. The way to tell the hyoid bone apart from the infant mandible is when you're looking on this infant mandible, you can see the mandibular head as well as the condylar processes. And over here, these greater horns are sitting right anteriorly, so just think of it as babies don't have fangs.